the Census Bureau came out with some new and extremely disturbing statistics. And it tells us why so many Americans are frustrated and angry with what's going on in Washington, and why so many people respond to pollsters and say, yes, we believe the country is going in the wrong direction. And what they're saying is true. They have every reason to be angry, every reason to be frustrated, and in fact, economically, this country is moving in a very significant way in the wrong direction. This is what the Census Bureau reported yesterday. They said that the typical middle-class family, that family right in the middle of American society, that median family income today is less than it was 24 years ago. Median family income today for that typical American family is less than it was 24 years ago. In 2012, typical middle-class families, that family right in the middle, made $51,017. Back in 1989, that family made $51,681. What does that mean? It means that 24 years later, after all of the effort and the hard work of people, today they are worse off than they were 24 years ago. Let's think about what that means. It means that despite the explosion of technology and all of the robotics and all of the cell phones and everything else that has made this economy more productive, the median family income today is worse than it was 24 years ago. Now, I'll just give you an example of what that means. If, Madam President, during that period from 1989 through 2012, that typical American family had received just a 2% increase in their income, just 2%, a very modest increase, that family today, instead of making $51,000 a year, would be making $81,000 a year, $30,000 gap. So if over that 24-year period, people had seen a modest, I'm not talking about a huge increase, a modest increase in their income of 2%, which people certainly deserve, that family would make $81,000 a year. Today, that family is making $51,000 a year, less than that family was making 24 years ago. And this is what the Census Bureau also reported. They said that the typical middle-class family has seen its income go down by more than $5,000 since 1999 after adjusting for inflation. $5,000. They told us that the average male worker made $283 less last year than that same worker made 44 years ago. So you want to know why people are angry? They see an explosion of technology, they see an explosion of productivity, and yet a male worker today is making less than a male worker, an average male worker made 44 years ago. Average female workers earned $1,775 less than they did in 2007. A record-breaking 46.5 million Americans lived in poverty last year. That is more people living in poverty than at any time in American history. Mr. President, 16 million children live in poverty. That's almost 22% of all kids in America. That is the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. That is the future of America, and over 1 out of 5 kids in this country are living in poverty. Mr. President, a higher percentage of African Americans lived in poverty last year than was the case 15 years ago. 9.1% of seniors lived in poverty last year, higher than in 2009. More American seniors were living in poverty last year than in 1972. Today, 48 million Americans are uninsured, no health insurance. That will change as a result of Obamacare, but as of today, 48 million Americans are uninsured, 3 million more than in 2008. So, Mr. President, when people call your office in Delaware or my office in Vermont, and they say, you know what, we are hurting, they are telling the truth. What they are saying is Congress seems to deal with everything except the reality facing the middle class and working families of this country. And people worry desperately not only for themselves, they worry more for their kids. What kind of education will their kids have? Will there be enough teachers in the classroom? Will their kids be able to afford to go to college? Will young working families be able to find quality, affordable child care? What kind of jobs will their kids have when they get out of high school or they get out of college? Those are the questions that tens of millions of Americans are asking all over this country, and here in Washington, we are not giving them clear and straightforward answers. Now, Mr. President, what makes this moment in American history unique is that while the great American middle class is disappearing, and while the number of Americans living in poverty is at an all-time high, something else is going on in this society. And that is that the people on top, the top 1%, have never, ever had it so good. Now, last week we learned an astounding fact. I want everybody to hear this clearly. And that is between 2009 and 2012, the last years we have information, 95% of all new income created in this country went to the top 1%. 95% of all of the new income created in America went to the top 1%, and the bottom 99% shared in 4% of the new income. So what we are seeing as a nation is the disappearance of the middle class, millions of families leaving the middle class and into poverty, struggling desperately to feed their families, to put gas in their car to get to work, to survive on an $8 an hour wage. You got that reality over there, and then you got another reality, is that the people on top are doing better than at any time since before the Great Depression. Today, Mr. President, the top 1% owns 38% of the nation's financial wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 60%, the majority of the American people together, own only 2.3% of the wealth in this country. We used to, when I was in school, and I'm sure all over this country, kids studied what we called oligarchy. And an oligarchy is a nation in which a handful of very wealthy people control the economy, control the politics of the nation, and it doesn't really matter about political parties because they own those parties as well. Well, guess what? What we used to look at Latin America and laugh about or worry about has now come home to this country. Today in America, we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and that gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider. Now, I don't believe that the American people feel that what this great country should be about is that the top 1% own 38% of the wealth, while the bottom 60% own barely 2% of the wealth. That is not the dream of what this great country was about. Mr. President, earlier this week, Forbes magazine reported that the wealthiest 400 Americans in this country, 400 people, are now worth a record-breaking $2 trillion. 400 people worth $2 trillion. In other words, the concentration of wealth is getting greater and greater and greater. The wealthiest 400 Americans now own more wealth than the bottom half of Americans, over 150 million Americans. We could probably squeeze 400 people into this room. And if we did, and they were the wealthiest people in this country, 400 people in this room would own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the American people. Just one family in America, the Walton family, the owners of Walmart, are worth over $100 billion and own more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans. Mr. President, while the middle class disappears, while children in this country go hungry, while veterans sleep out on the street, corporate profits are now at an all-time high, while wages as a share of the economy are at a record low. Wall Street, the major financial institutions in this country, whose greed and recklessness drove us into this economic downturn, and the group of people that the American middle class bailed out 5 years ago, they are now doing phenomenally well. So Wall Street drives the country into a severe economic downturn. Wall Street is bailed out by the American middle class. Wall Street now is doing phenomenally well while the middle class is disappearing. And you want to know why the American people are angry and disgusted and frustrated? That's why.